Welcome to our first Timothy Dwight College Fellows Talk of the 2023-24 academic year. It's my pleasure to introduce Richard Rosenfeld, TD class of 1963, to present his talk, When Yale Buildings Speak, the Eponymic Voices of Timothy Dwight College. And today we're just joined by a ton of special guests. We have dear friends and family who are here, as well as our TD students. TD students, make yourselves known. So we typically don't get the opportunity to have our students join us in the fellows. I'm not sure you meant to be so divisive, like you're there and they're all here. But really, this is one of, I hope, more of these opportunities to bring the fellows and the students together. But today, it just seemed really important for students to join us. Richard Rosenfeld, as many of you know, is the namesake of the building we currently occupy for today's talk. So it's totally fitting. And how many of you live in RH right now? So, yay. But basically, for those of you who don't know the history of the building, in 1985, Mr. Rosenfeld generously donated $500,000 for a much-needed modernization of Yale's language laboratory, which was housed at 111 Grove Street. The building also served as the annex for TD, as it still does today. And over the years, he's given generously to not only support the language laboratories, but really refurbish the building's dormitories so that our students now enjoy it as the highly sought-after residence that it is known for today. So we know it as the beautiful dorm with large hallways, gorgeous windows, and functioning bathrooms is all thanks to you. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite things that when I was working on this introduction was digging in the archives of the YDN, and there was a student by the name of Marco Naguib, who you all know as one of the artists who did the tunnel. He did the Keith Haring-inspired mural. And Marco wrote, so it was on the 9th anniversary of the building having been renamed Rosenfeld Hall. He said something like, the toilets are still flushing. So, and this was featured like in the YDN, which I thought was just adorable. So, acknowledging the importance of Mr. Rosenfeld's gift, Yale President A. Bartlett Giamatti, himself a scholar of Renaissance literature, said, quote, "The study of languages is fundamental to a liberal education and is thus a central part of the Yale curriculum." Mr. Rosenfeld has had a remarkable career since graduating from Yale and is very much an entrepreneur, a scholar, a political activist who has remained intellectually curious and a true Renaissance man. He made his fortune as the founder and president of the largest U.S. charter vacation company, known as International Weekends Charter Vacations, Inc. of Boston. And in the early 1970s, when he began the enterprise, he asked, quote, "What good is Americans' freedoms to travel if most people can't afford it?" So what did he do? He started a business to face that issue head on. And not satisfied with that accomplishment, he then turned his hand at historical research as an independent scholar on the early American Republic. In 1997, he published with St. Martin's Press his magnum opus, American Aurora, A Democratic Republican Returns, the suppressed history of our nation's beginnings and the heroic newspaper that tried to report it. So, to quote yet another Yale president, Rick Levin, he said, "It's a strikingly original work documenting how our First Amendment freedoms were threatened in the early years of the Republic." He has since appeared many times on National Public Radio and wrote provocative essays, including his 2004 essay in Harper's that called for the abolishing of the U.S. Senate. So you can certainly ask him about that. Published shortly after the contentious 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush, and during a time of political partisanship and stalemates, the article's points of the fragility of American democracy seems as much an issue today as it was 2 decades ago. So now we eagerly wait your address, Mr. Rosenfeld.
So, I'm sure for many of you, this is the first time you've ever heard a building speak. So if my voice seems a little funny. Okay. So this talk is a message to the students of Timothy Dwight College and to the fellows of Timothy Dwight College and to the Yale community at large. In September of 1985, at the dedication of Rosenfeld Hall, I joked that old graduates never die, they just become dormitories. At that time, Rosenfeld Hall was principally Yale's language laboratory. But since then, the building's been reconfigured to provide more TD housing, so my joke became prophecy. Now I really am a dormitory. Mary Lou, the head of this college, has invited this old dormitory to share his thoughts about Yale with you. In this year of my 60th Yale reunion, last reunion, as well as my 82nd birthday, I feel privileged to tell you not only what I hope my building says, but also what I hope other epidemic figures of TD might say, especially the two Yale presidents, the Reverends Timothy Dwight, for whom the college is named, and the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, for whom the Common Room in Rosenfeld Hall is named. This is a good time for these epidemic figures to speak. So, what do we figures from the past have to share with you? Situated as we are in different centuries, in different life stories, and in different Yale relationships, what common experience have we had that might serve as a lesson for today? I think there's at least one, which is this: that contrary to what many believe, the Enlightenment was not simply an historical period of intellectual and philosophical development. The Enlightenment was also a choice that this nation and Yale have had to make and will continue to have to make each and every day. When the first Timothy Dwight became president of Yale, it was during the U.S. presidency of George Washington. The period we call the Enlightenment was at its end, and the United States of America was at its beginning. Revolutions in England, France, and the United States were then complete, with each country possessing a Bill of Rights to guarantee the freedoms for which its revolution was fought. Important Americans had advocated for freedom in each of these countries. Thomas Jefferson, America's ambassador to France, had co-authored France's Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen at the beginning of the French Revolution, as he had urged a Bill of Rights at the end of the United States Revolution. Thomas Paine had galvanized support for the American Revolution with his pamphlet Common Sense and his plan for an American democracy. Had gotten himself outlawed in England for writing against monarchy, had helped draft a constitution for the first French Republic, and finally in 1794 capped the Enlightenment with his book The Age of Reason, which challenged the dogma and authority of established religion. According to Paine, the age of faith was gone. The age of reason was now at hand. Tom Paine and his Age of Reason were very popular at Yale when Timothy Dwight became its president in 1795. As one student, Lyman Beecher, recalled, and I quote, "Before he came, college was in a most ungodly state. The college church was almost extinct. That was the day of the infidelity of the Tom Paine school. Boys that dressed flax in the barn, as I used to, read Tom Paine and believed him. Most in the class before me were infidels and called each other Voltaire, Rousseau, D'Alembert, etc., etc." Close quote. Yet a Tom Paine school was not a school that Yale's new president could tolerate. For the Reverend Timothy Dwight, the age of faith was still at hand. Timothy Dwight was a charming and charismatic human being who believed in Yale's original mission to be a divinity school, but did not support, either for the nation or for Yale, the toleration or the democracy that Enlightenment philosophers espoused. Timothy Dwight reflected the values of his home state of Connecticut, which taxed all citizens, regardless of their religion, to support its established Congregational church, allowed an old aristocracy of fewer than a dozen Yale families, the standing order, to run its affairs since colonial times, and resisted replacing its old colonial constitution with a new state constitution until well into the 19th century. From colonial days through the presidency of Timothy Dwight, only white, male, Protestant property owners could hold public office in Connecticut. Timothy Dwight's opposition to Enlightenment philosophes and the French Revolution made him not only a leader in his home state of Connecticut, but also an important ally to George Washington's Federalist administration, which had grown disillusioned with the French Revolution and with ideologues like Paine, Voltaire, and Rousseau. In recent years, the French Revolution had turned increasingly violent, executing the French king, guillotining many prominent aristocrats, and disestablishing its Christian church, and replacing old state churches with so-called temples of reason. During the 2 years prior to the election of Timothy Dwight, the radical Jacobin Maximilien Robespierre and his sans-culotte street people had made the guillotine a frightening symbol of what their revolution meant. George Washington's vice president, John Adams, was particularly incensed by the French Revolution and by Tom Paine's Democratic writings, commenting to Thomas Jefferson, "What a poor, ignorant, malicious, short-sighted, crapulous mass is Tom Paine's common sense." Adams' home state of Massachusetts, like Connecticut, had an official state church and an undemocratic constitution that Adams himself had drafted, including substantial property and religious qualifications for voting and office holding. Adams saw pure democracy as the road to mob rule, and in his mind, France had proven the case. Yet America's Democrats strongly disagreed. American Democrats like Thomas Jefferson supported the French Revolution and the democratic ideals that Enlightenment philosophes had championed. Jefferson had persuaded his home state of Virginia to disestablish its official state church, and he opposed wealth or property qualifications for voting or office holding. He championed freedoms of religion and expression that we find in the Bill of Rights, and he instilled the idea that all men are created equal in the dreams of many American Democrats. Disagreement about support for the French Revolution divided America into our two-party system. After George Washington failed to support the new Democratic Republic of France, despite an alliance promising to do so, Thomas Jefferson led many Americans who themselves wanted a more democratic republic to form the Democratic Republican Party. Thus, when John Adams succeeded George Washington to the U.S. presidency in 1797, he faced a Democratic opposition that made his own task very much the same as Timothy Dwight's at Yale, which was to defend against the influence of French philosophers and to overcome his Democratic opposition. To defend against the influence of the Tom Paine School at Yale, Timothy Dwight required Calvinist religious instruction for all Yale students, imposed punishments for any denial of Scripture, made attendance at his Calvinist Congregational church compulsory, and forbade attendance at other churches, even for Episcopalians. Month after month, he preached the Bible as truth to Yale students, and he converted 1/3 of the student body to his Calvinist faith. Adams did not have Timothy Dwight's powers of persuasion, but he did, as president, command the new federal government, which he used so undemocratically that many thought he wanted to be king. He used a sedition act in violation of the First Amendment to jail his newspaper critics and even a U.S. congressman. And he used immigration laws to keep French refugees from obtaining U.S. citizenship and thereby the chance to vote for his opposition. He proclaimed national holidays for prayer and fasting to ally his administration with the religious establishment. And he used his new federal army as well as private Federalist militias to suppress popular dissent. Thomas Jefferson called Adams' presidency a, quote, reign of witches, close quote. By the summer of 1798, the battle between John Adams' Federalists and Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans was at a fever pitch. On Independence Day, the 4th of July in 1798, while Yale's President Timothy Dwight, by then known as the Pope of Federalism, was preaching in New Haven against Enlightenment philosophes in the French Revolution and in praise of John Adams' administration, students at William and Mary College in Thomas Jefferson's Virginia were burning John Adams in effigy. That was the depth of the divide. For many, the presidential election of 1800 was a second American Revolution, deciding that Jefferson's dream of democracy was America's dream as well. John Adams' undemocratic theory and practice of government not only cost him that presidential election, it cost his Federalist Party both houses of Congress and the chance ever to govern again. Democracy was America's future, though not so clearly for Yale. For the next 100 years, the nation continued on the Enlightenment path that the nation chose in 1800. By mid-century, all states, including Connecticut and Massachusetts, disestablished their official state churches and removed property and religious qualifications from voting and office holding. During the 1860s, the nation elevated Thomas Jefferson's messages of equality over any remembrance of his slaveholding to fight a war that ended slavery and allowed constitutional amendments to require states, as much as the federal government, to honor the Bill of Rights. Yet for the same 100 years, Yale retained its theocratic presidency and its mandated religious observance, and in 1886 chose its second Reverend Timothy Dwight, a biblical scholar and grandson of the first, to be its president and religious leader, just as Yale College was becoming Yale University. Ironically, Tom Paine's Age of Reason would haunt this Timothy Dwight just as it had his grandfather. To the dismay of religious leaders like Timothy Dwight, religious skepticism had been gaining ground during the course of the 19th century, as evangelical revivals and increasing American Arminianism fractured mainstream Calvinism into many Protestant denominations, and as advances in technology and two industrial revolutions allowed science to challenge religion as the best measure of human accomplishment. Furthermore, in 1859, Charles Darwin challenged the biblical story of creation by offering evolution and natural selection as alternative explanations for the origin of the species, whereupon two schools of Darwinian thought totally abandoned biblical injunctions to help the poor and disadvantaged in favor of allowing natural selection to run its course. The first of these was social Darwinism, advocated by British sociologist Herbert Spencer, who first identified natural selection as the survival of the fittest and proposed unfettered competition to reward the fittest, with no social safety nets for those who were not. The second of these was eugenics, the name and pseudoscience that Darwin's second cousin Francis Galton attached to his plan to breed human beings selectively. That is, to accelerate natural selection by getting society's most desirable people to multiply and preventing its least desirable people from doing the same. Eugenicists, enthusiasts for eugenics found apparent support for Galton's plan in the green pea plant experiments of geneticist Gregor Mendel, which demonstrated that selective breeding could make the inheritance of dominant traits mathematically predictable. By the beginning of the 20th century, eugenics had become a popular social movement, and for some, even an existential philosophy, by its association with German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who, writing at the same time as Galton, declared that God is dead and that a new ethics based on everyone's pursuit of his own self-fulfillment and a new societal goal of producing the superior human, the Übermensch, offered better roads to any promised land. As the 20th century unfolded, Adolf Hitler would adopt this thinking as in his genocidal pursuit of an Aryan master race. Yale University would adopt this thinking in its discriminatory pursuit of the ideal Yale man. And in the minds of many, the Übermensch, the Aryan, and the Yale man merged into the same Northern European archetype. In all events, at the end of the 19th century, in the face of increasing religious skepticism, and upon the retirement of Yale's second Reverend Timothy Dwight in 1899, Yale finally embraced the disestablishmentarianism of the Enlightenment and chose to disestablish the Congregational Church from its presidency. For the first time in 200 years, Yale would choose a president who was neither an ordained Christian minister nor even an avowed Congregationalist. Arthur Twining Hadley was a railroad expert, an economist, and a social Darwinist who favored an unregulated economy as a racetrack for the fittest and 19th century monopolies as appropriate rewards for those who won. As Hadley correctly observed, we've lost faith in supernatural manifestations of power, in certain dogmas and formulas once supposed to be essential to salvation. We've gained faith in man, faith in law, faith in the truths of nature, and faith in the justice of God. In this new, more secular Yale, compulsory church attendance would soon be gone. Though the Enlightenment scientific method and religious skepticism had found traction in the nation and at Yale during the course of the 19th century, the Enlightenment's vision of toleration and equal rights remained a dream as yet unachieved. American blacks, though freed from enslavement, were still segregated from the rest of American society, as were Asians who were subject to exclusion laws, as were Jews and Catholics who suffered social, cultural, and religious discrimination, as were women who were subordinate by law. To make things worse, a flood of Catholic, Jewish, and other non-Protestant refugees from Eastern and Southern Europe were heeding the call of Lady Liberty and clamoring for entry to America. Some of their children sought entry to Yale. So at the start of the 20th century, as at the start of the 19th century, the Enlightenment posed questions of equality and toleration that the nation and Yale would again have to decide. The first decades of the 20th century are known as the Progressive Era, when, among other efforts to democratize the country, a major push for equality began. In those early years, civil rights organizations like the ACLU, the NAACP, and the Anti-Defamation League were formed. In 1913, thousands of suffragettes made a march on Washington, and in 1920, a constitutional amendment gave women the right to vote. Yale, however, remained steadfastly distant from equality and toleration. The same belief in science that had freed Yale from the intolerance of a theocratic leadership now produced a comparable intolerance in the racism and eugenics of Yale President James Rowland Angell, who succeeded Arthur Twining Hadley in 1921. James Rowland Angell believed that the human races differ appreciably in their native intelligence. Within a year of his inauguration, he welcomed the American Eugenics Society, which would lead the American eugenics movement for the next 20 years, to establish its headquarters on the Yale campus. And in 1924, he created the Institute of Psychology to make Yale the preeminent research center for the study of eugenics and racial behavior. Both organizations were headed by Yale faculty. From the start of his administration, Angell monitored the enrollment of racial and religious minorities at Yale, examining in particular what he called the problem of Jewish enrollment. In 1922, he instituted a Committee on the Limitation of Numbers, which imposed new restrictions and policies on undergraduate admissions starting in 1923, and which kept Yale College entirely white, except for tokens, 10% Jewish, and just above 10% Catholic from 1923 through the time I entered Yale under the 10% Jewish quota in 1959. Similar restrictions also affected the graduate schools, with instructions to the medical school admissions committee: never admit more than 5 Jews, take only 2 Italian Catholics, and take no blacks at all. A decade after the imposition of these restrictions, James Rowland Angell responded to a report from his admission director that many of Yale's Jewish applicants were from New Haven, Bridgeport, and Hartford. It seems quite clear, Angell answered, that if we could have an Armenian massacre confined to the New Haven district with occasional incursions into Bridgeport and Hartford, we might protect our Nordic stock almost completely. When William Sloane Coffin became Yale's new chaplain in 1958, the university had no expectation that anything was about to change. Yale's president at that time was A. Whitney Griswold, who had been a student at Yale in the 1920s when James Rowland Angell was president, and was a direct linear descendant of the Griswold family who had ruled Connecticut as part of the state's standing order when the first Timothy Dwight was president. William Sloane Coffin also bore the mantle of Yale's traditional leadership as an ordained congregational minister of pure English ancestry who was white, a Yale graduate, as were his brother, father, uncle, and grandfather, and of wealth and social prominence. In short, A. Whitney Griswold and William Sloane Coffin looked like old Yale. So what happened at Yale when Bill Coffin took the pulpit came as a complete surprise to students, faculty, alumni, and administration alike. As I wrote in a piece for the Yale Daily News, upon ascending Yale's pulpit in 1958, Bill Coffin spoke boldly and in a fashion that Yale had never heard before, enunciating articles of faith he described as, quote, the uncomfortable gospel. As Battelle Chapel filled, soon with people of all religions to hear him, he preached that Yale should care about disenfranchised black people, about victimized Asians, about Jews, Catholics, the poor, and everyone else. He said Yale should eschew bigotry and prejudice, that its admissions and society should be open to all who are qualified, regardless of race, creed, religion, color, or social class. He said Yale should be something better than an enclave for the privileged. It should be a moral example to the world and concerned citizen of the world. From the moment he arrived at Yale and during the ensuing decade of the 1960s, William Sloane Coffin exercised his moral authority to lead Yale away from a quarter millennium of fashionable bigotries and clubby isolation to embrace a set of values as democratic as the U.S. Constitution and as outreaching as the Statue of Liberty. 2 years after his arrival at Yale, and in the highly charged atmosphere of moral expectation and social awareness that his ministry had created, Coffin confronted A. Whitney Griswold with accusations of racial and religious discrimination in Yale admission. When Griswold balked at the claims, Coffin warned the Yale president that he would be an unremitting conscience of Yale on the subject, whereupon Griswold reluctantly gave Coffin permission to conduct an investigation of the charges. Coffin did so in 1961, and with the support of Yale's other religious leaders, proved the discrimination to Griswold in March of 1962, convincing him that admissions needed to change. 1 month later, the Yale President's Committee on the Freshman Year proposed new admissions policy, omitting race and religion as factors in admission, elevating outstanding intellectual capacity as the preeminent criterion for acceptance, and recommending that women be admitted. On May 19, the Yale Corporation approved these proposals. The proposals became policy, and Yale's long history of institutional racism and religious intolerance finally came to an end. I see William Sloane Coffin, not Elihu Yale, as the founder of the Yale we know today. As the plaque in the William Sloane Coffin Common Room attests, under his moral leadership in the 1960s, Yale opened wide its doors to all of the human family. And so it was a quarter millennium after its founding that Yale finally chose the open-mindedness and the liberalism of the Enlightenment, the equality of Thomas Jefferson, the toleration and empiricism of John Locke, the intellectualism of Voltaire, the optimism of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the individualism of Adam Smith, and the opposition to dogma of Tom Paine's Age of Reason. The Age of Reason was now welcome at Yale, as were the open-mindedness and liberalism that lie at the heart of the Enlightenment. So, what about this fellow Rosenfeld? Under Bill Coffin's moral leadership, I was transformed from a child of the 1950s to what everyone understands to be a child of the 1960s. As an undergraduate, I joined Bill Coffin's freedom rides and sit-ins to integrate blacks in the South, wrote against racial segregation, and started a political magazine to encourage debate. I withdrew from my fraternity when its national charter prevented the acceptance of an African-American applicant. As a child of the 60s, I created a business that enabled 1 million less privileged Americans to travel, including thousands of African Americans who visited ancestral roots in West Africa, wrote a revisionist history of the early American Republic to show the benefits of teaching history from Thomas Jefferson's democratic Republican point of view, and tried to address homelessness through board service for the Salvation Army, and to advance civil liberties through board service for the ACLU and the NAACP. And so we come to Rosenfeld Hall. The greatest opposition to the changes that William Sloane Coffin championed at Yale came from old Yale alumni, who remembered their Yale as a fraternity of white, Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, private school graduates, males who were the legacies of Yale men who had gone before. The new Yale would not be the Yale they remembered, despite the efforts of the alumni office to reassure them otherwise. Those old Yale alumni, and even the Yale alumni office, were of a different temporal community, which would only diversify when future student bodies became old alumni like themselves. When that time came, as it did by the 1980s, only one temporal community remained to diversify, which was the community of eponymic figures whose names graced the buildings and other places at Yale. As I commented to Yale President A. Bartlett Giamatti, who was Yale's first non-Anglo-Saxon and first non-Protestant president, at the dedication of Rosenfeld Hall, I look forward to a time when the name on Yale's buildings and other places would exhibit the same diversity as a student body that Bill Coffin had championed. That would be a final measure of the distance Yale had traveled from the time of the first Timothy Dwight. Thus it is as a remembrance of William Sloane Coffin and as a product of the 1960s that Rosenfeld Hall and I stand before you today. With the other eponymic figures whose names adorn TD buildings, I'm here to remind you that the Enlightenment was not just a period of cultural and philosophical development, but rather a choice that Yale and the nation have had to make and will continue to have to make each and every day. For the future, I hope that Yale will always choose the Enlightenment and defend Enlightenment values whenever they come under attack. Whenever, for example, politics, tribalism, ignorance, superstition, or demagoguery threatens to diminish our belief in science, our respect for an honest press, our demand for proof and facts, our appreciation for racial, religious, and other diversity, our commitment to democracy and full representation, our goal of an enlightened citizenry, our demand for equal rights and opportunity, our freedoms to inquire, to think, and opine, our toleration of idiosyncrasy and eccentricity, our encouragement of critical thinking, our expectation of fair and impartial justice, our belief in the rule of law, our commitment to the separation of church and state, our belief in the individualism of free and competitive enterprise, our pursuit of the general will for the sake of the common weal, and last but not least, our expectation that open-mindedness, facts, reason, truth, and a very liberal education will chart the nation's best road ahead. About the road ahead, I will close with an observation of the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, who intoned with his usual moral clarity, remember that even if you win the rat race, you're still a rat. So, in the footsteps of those who gave us the Enlightenment, let's all try to do some good. Thank you.
So I know he will take questions, and your choice is to stand or be seated for questions.
I think
It's up to
I'll
you.
stand.
You want to stay? Okay. And do you want to field
Your
your own
smile
questions?
kept me going.
Okay, go.
So I thought that was a lovely thesis, the era of Timothy Dwight and the era of Sloane Coffin. Dwight believed in instant conversion, and you even had a statistic how many young men at Yale converted it to the anti-Enlightenment establishmentarianism. How many of your era were instant converts or close to instant converts, four-year converts to the gospel of Sloane Coffin? And among those who did not convert in the time you were all here as young men at Yale, how did it go afterwards in those 60 years?
I have lots of stories about the time. It's hard to imagine what it was like to be here in the early 1960s. After all, the Yale chaplain had been hired by the university to preach in Battelle Chapel. And he wasn't doing that. He was down south, getting jailed in Birmingham, Alabama for trying to get blacks into restaurants and stuff. And we were raising money on old campus to get his bail money together. The place was wild. The trustees were going nuts. The faculty were going nuts. The alumni were going nuts. Because what was this guy who we hired to be in Battelle Chapel doing with blacks down south? There were no blacks at Yale. What's this all about? And so Bill Coffin, his ability to change the university's admission standards and everything else came out of the authority, the moral authority he had in going out to the streets of Alabama and working with these blacks in churches and everything else to make the change. Yale led the civil rights movement among students. Coffin, Benjamin Spock, and others were jailed. But Yale was the leader. And the result was, not only did Yale change the nation, or help to substantially down south, Yale changed itself. When Coffin came back from this, with the authority that he had acquired, the moral authority he had acquired from doing all this, despite the protest, the noise, the alumni, the trustees, and everything else, there was no way Whitney Griswold, when he walked into his office, could say, I'm not doing anything about this. And he said, I'm going to persist. So that moral authority that Yale acquired and that Coffin acquired by going out into the streets and straightening out stuff, that was converted everybody. Now, there are lots of stories. One story is, I know a lot of guys in my class who were from the South, who were racist, who felt that the culture in the South shouldn't permit whites and blacks to mingle. This is a cultural thing. They've always been this way. They get along. Everything's okay. And besides, the blacks weren't equipped and all the rest of it. So one night, Bill Coffin invited all of these kids, like 20 of them, from the South, guys I knew, who were really racist. And he said, give me your arguments. And they sat and he gave Coffin's arguments. And then after a while, he said, would you mind if I have somebody else join us? And he opened the kitchen door. It's all emotional stuff. And in marched Marion Wright Edelman, who was a law student, black, who founded the Children's Fund, the stuff. And in, in 5 minutes, it was clear that she was the smartest person in the room. And these 20 kids went away with a whole different. I was involved in raising money for the Coffin Common Room. And one of the major donor there was a kid whose father told him when he left for Yale in the 1960s, whatever you do, don't go near this guy Coffin. He was from Alabama. Okay? Don't go near this guy Coffin. And he was one of the 20 who. So, a bunch of years later, he was the largest. He was the largest donor to the Coffin Common Room, aside from one other. So it was an extraordinary time. So the question is, where are the students today? Where's the leadership of higher education today? You got a man running for president who wants to ban certain books in public schools, who wants to create a distrust of science, who's anxious to bring the Protestant church back into politics to dictate policy and decisions, who wants to slant the court in a religious direction. Now, where are the students today defending the Enlightenment, against this kind of behavior? Where's higher education's leadership in stepping forward and condemning these activities? You know, you have a man in the Senate from a Yale graduate who cheered the attack on the Congress. He was out there pumping his horn. Where is the voice that says that is not what a Yale graduate does? That is not what someone who believes in the Enlightenment does, who believes in our system of government, which we got from the Enlightenment. That's not consistent. But where are the voices in America to stand up and say no? And where could there be the voice of higher education, the people who are less educated, to say, this is wrong? And the same way Bill Coffin went out and created a mess at Yale. A mess. Really, a mess. To do the right thing and enforce the right values that are enlightened values. Toleration, that's John Locke. Right? But look at the good. Go from doing that. So I would have by now expected student movements to protect the Enlightenment, to condemn what's going on out there. I would expect a council of university presidents to be condemning, in the name of the Enlightenment, behavior that's inconsistent with it. The fact is, as Bill Coffin used to say, if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. And right now, we've got a country that's falling for anything because no one's standing up for what's right. So, you know, the Enlightenment is a nonpartisan standard you can take out to society, to institutions, and say, this is wrong. There's no one against the Enlightenment. So you have a weapon that is a phenomenal weapon, nonpartisan weapon, that can reflect highest education, the standards of the highest institutions in the society, and can say what's right, what's wrong. And the problem with society today is that nobody's quite doing that. So, guys, long answer to your question, please.
I'm from that era where I lived in New Haven, and you had to go to Patel to hear Coffin, whether you were a Yaley or not a Yaley. The conversation was, you went to chapel, and then you called your friends or your relatives to discuss what Coffin had imparted to you. And then I became a member of the Yale class of '71. What impact did Kingman Brewster have on it? Because I don't think you mentioned Brewster,
Okay.
and I thought that Kingman was one of the people who helped to support.
So I'm going to give you a profound,
Coffin
I'm going to give you what
waivers.
I think, modestly speaking, of course, is a profound insight to the current decisions on race and stuff, and this recent Supreme Court decision about who you accept and not accept. In 1922, when James Rowland Angel wanted to put quotas in for Jews and everybody else at Yale, he was talking to other university presidents, including Lawrence Lowell at Harvard. Lawrence Lowell at Harvard advised him not to do quotas, because if he did quotas, Lowell found they got a huge pushback from the corporation saying that's not compatible with the traditions or whatever. So Angel didn't do quotas. What he did was this. He set himself goals, 10% Jews, 10% Catholics. And then he said, okay, how do we achieve it? Well, if we take legacies and we concentrate on a lot of legacies, if we haven't any Jews in the past, the legacies will all be white, Anglo-Saxon, Christian, whatever. So we focus on legacies. Let's look for schools, feeder schools. Exeter, Andover, they don't have any Jews, they don't have any, they'll give us people of the sort we want. Let's choose the geography where we're going to solicit students. Let's go to Greenwich, Connecticut, let's not go to the Bronx. Let's choose where we solicit. Let's focus on private education, not public, etc. So basically what he did is set up a lot of practices that achieved each year these things. So both Coffin and everybody else could deny there were any quotas at Yale. But of course, when you look at the outcome, there's 10% Jews every year, you say something's going on. So when they decided to throw away race and religion in admitting to Yale, okay, that's the policy, 1962 May. But the practices were all in place. And those practices had constituencies. Now those constituencies weren't about discriminating on race and religion. They were parents who wanted their kids to go to Yale legacies. You know, they were feeder schools like Andover and Exeter who wanted the same number of kids to go every year. So you had constituencies to maintain the practices. So during the 1960s, after the decision in 1962, you basically had to undo the practices. You had to go to public education. You had to go to Bronx High School science. You had to not take all your people from Andover. Not all you could. You had to shift. And it was a battle. You had to bring in women. How quickly? How many men do we still have? All these decisions from 1962 were in play. And after that is the story of Brewster and Inky Clark and other people. And those are heroic stories too. But they weren't heroic stories on stopping racial and religious discrimination at Yale. That had been decided in 1962 with Bill Coffin. They were decisions about how quickly do we have, how many do we take from public education, private, how many do we, you know, how do we undo legacies? So now, when the Supreme Court says that legacies are a form of discrimination, they have a case because legacies have been used that way to discriminate in the past. So, now that's not to say that legacies don't have a role in university loyalty and all that stuff. They do. But the argument that these practices, public school, private school, and where they give financial aid, one of the things Angel did was to make sure Jews never got financial aid. Financial aid only went to weddings and Carson. So those practices are what occupied the battle at Yale during the 1960s after the decision in 1962. The decision was made, but that doesn't mean there weren't heroes thereafter, because if you were moving away from legacies, you would have alumni crying bullshit. If you stopped taking Andover Exeter allowed Bronx High School, obviously Andover Exeter and all their folk are going to be on your tail. So that wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. But understanding that the Brewster story is a story about undoing practices that have been put in place in the 1920s to achieve racial and religious goals. And that's the inside story. And that's what gives a certain verisimilitude to the Supreme Court position, the legacies of this and that and the other thing. So you're really going to sort through and say, well, what is the effect of legacies? What is the effect of this? That's legitimate. On the other hand, you have a Supreme Court that can't tell the difference between discriminating to keep people out that you have racial and religious prejudice against and discriminating for the sake of including more people. If you can't tell the difference between one and the other, then you're really intellectually defunct. So and that's sort of where the court is on a variety of issues. I could argue other cases too. Okay?
Isn't it a zero-sum game though? I mean, if there's only so many seats distributed for it, exactly the same thing as distributing against mathematics.
Right. So let's see. If I arrive, you take people who can afford to go to college, you discriminate against those who can't afford it. Of those who can't afford it, there are more blacks than whites. You can take anything and see its effect on the other person. But on this point here, yes, if you have no Asians in your class, and you want Asians in order to create a class that reflects the country, reflects the values of the country, is going to be the society into which people go and live and have to work and whatever. If you want that, yes, if you take the Asians, fewer whites, no question. But is it the right of a university to populate itself in a way it thinks most benefits the students? Not discriminating against groups of race and religion, but rather bringing together a community, like the community we have, that exposes people to people's differences and all the rest of it. And if you have to bring in people, sure, I mean, who can't? That's life. But it's not discrimination. It's not what Bill Coffin fought against. It wasn't the discrimination that the whole world of the 20th century tried to eliminate. That's a discrimination of an entirely different and irrelevant order, in my view.
In keeping with the idea of incomplete enlightenment, what would you say is the greatest world challenge facing Yale in the 21st century that Yale can meet in the spirit of Reverend Kaufman?
Understand what you have here today is something. I'll give you a quick history lesson. At the end of the Constitutional Convention, 1787, there were a bunch of people who did not like the Constitution. For example, Thomas Paine didn't like it at all, he was in Europe. Benjamin Franklin, he didn't want an upper house. He didn't want to have a separate executive branch. He didn't want any of that. Even James Madison didn't want to have voting by state in the Senate. And Thomas Jefferson thought the Senate was a totally un-Republican institution. But what did they say? Benjamin Franklin, in fact, a Boston newspaper reported that Benjamin Franklin wept at the end of the Constitution. He was so unhappy, it was so undemocratic. But what did Franklin say? He said, whatever faults I have, problems I have with the Constitution, if the American people are good, they'll make it work. And James Madison said exactly the same thing, but the opposite. He said, we've done a lot of work, he's considered the father of the Constitution. He said, whatever we've done, as good as it may be, it won't work if the American people are bad, if they don't have civic virtue. In short, you have to have a culture of democratic republicanism to have our system. And the problem with what's happened over the last bunch of years is that politics has gone away from arguing about policy to arguing and degrading the culture, which is the precondition to have a democracy and all the rest of it. So the real question is, how do you can change laws, you can amend stuff, you can amend the Constitution. There are things you can do. What do you do about culture? What do you care if people don't care if you're trying to fix elections, if you're gerrymandering districts so that whoever the majority doesn't win, that you're trying to fix the Supreme Court to make decisions the way you want it, that you're inviting religion back into public life. If you're, what do you do about that? You know, and changing culture, getting back to an appreciation. Fair elections. Facts are facts. There are no alternative facts. You know, getting people back into the truth, fact, fair elections, respect for the independence of the judiciary, respect for the judiciary, for the justice system. How do you get back to respect for all these institutions? That's the big task for Yale and for the country. Now, I don't have the magic bullet, but I'll tell you this. It is a great disappointment to me that higher education has not had more of a voice in the public sphere. That higher education, which should be teaching, one of the things that in a talk I gave about Coffin a long time ago, I said, Coffin taught Yale students more from the jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama, than they learned in any classroom. You know? It is, teaching is not just classrooms. You know, this idea, 19th century idea of the university as kind of an autoerotic intellectual exercise you go off into the woods to do, you know. That's a wrong idea. That's an old idea. And it's not, it's not what Coffin taught. And it's not what I would like to see university do in its teaching. I think, as Coffin said, you got to teach by example. You got to go out and do stuff. And if you don't, then, you know, it's the ivy-covered escape from the world, and we're all becoming intellectually curious and stuff like that. Meanwhile, the world goes to hell in a handbasket with higher education, there'll be nothing to say about it. So, you know, that's my own personal take on all this stuff. Go ahead.
So what I really like about your speech and the general ideas in it is you've posed a problem, but you've also provided a solution. And the problem, among the many problems, but the problem that you just articulated now, that why doesn't higher education have more of a voice in opposing anti-democratic values, anti-enlightenment values? There's a lot of reasons why people are afraid to speak up. One is the speed with which people are quick to say you're partisan, and therefore you're brainwashing students, and therefore we're not going to send our kids to your school. Or, you know, when I say something that is perceived to be partisan, I can promise you, I get letters from senators and members of Congress launching investigations into things at Yale, or wanting information about donors, or about funds in the endowment, or about research grants, or whatever, right? There's this I don't know what you would call it. Retaliation that happens when you make, you know, and so that makes it tough. And some universities, Yale's not one of them, but some universities, like the University of Chicago, have announced as a matter of policy they are, quote, neutral, meaning they will not, that it is inappropriate for the university, the individuals in the university can take a partisan stand, but for the university to be seen as taking a partisan stand. I don't agree with that. I've taken partisan stands around immigration, around Ukraine, around DACA, a little more quietly around abortion rights. But I have to be really careful, because there is pushback when you do it. But you've provided the solution, which is not to talk about partisan political points of view, but talk about Enlightenment values. And if you're talking about freedom of expression, if you're talking about separation of church and state, if you're talking about freedom to read whatever you want to read, you know, freedom, against book banning or the state prescribing curricula, whatever, you can get to those small L liberal values without a little bit circumnavigating partisan politics, because you're talking about some core values, and I think that's a great approach. And I like your quietly you've suggested to me university presidents might work together, not necessarily to make a partisan statement, but to make a statement in support of Enlightenment values and against anti-democratic ideas in society. I think it's a way around the conundrum.
One of the really frightening documents recently has been Mitt Romney's Atlantic article, where he said, I believe, maybe he said in some other context, not inaccurate, he said that a lot of senators didn't vote for impeachment, in fact, almost all of them, because they were afraid for their families. They were afraid of physical violence against them, and that the MAGA movement represented a physical threat to those who wanted to stand up. So, I guess, if you stand up, you take a risk. That's the story of Bill Coughlin. So,
now, do you think, so I've often heard it said that Whitney Griswold and King and Brewster, even though they were catching all kinds of flack from trustees and donors and a piece of the student body and certainly alumni, neither of them ever fired Coughlin, even though both of them were more establishment-oriented figures in their beliefs that Coughlin was establishment also, but in that sense. But because by having the chaplain articulate these values, he could be a mouthpiece for what they wanted to say, but felt they couldn't as president.
And he was a Protestant.
Yeah, he was
This has
he was
all
a
been done
Protestant
to
chaplain.
defend Protestantism. And for the first time, you have a Protestant chaplain who stood up and saying you shouldn't be discriminating against Jews. So that's a different Protestant chaplain
Yeah.
than ever existed at Yale. Yeah.
I think that's right. So that I don't mean to monopolize.
No.
Yeah, so that's kind of the paradox in your talk, right? The paradox in your talk is you're championing the Enlightenment over church orthodoxy as the, represented by Timothy Dwight, both Timothy Dwights, as what universities should value, and I think probably most people in this room would agree with that. And yet, it was a person of the cloth, a minister, motivated by moral leadership and his own religious training, who stood up for Enlightenment values. Similarly, it was anti-religious values that brought us eugenics in some way, right? This was science's solution. So it's paradoxical.
I was going to say, I sent this talk around. There were a lot of people saw this talk before I gave it, okay, so there's a lot of input. But this morning I sent it to a friend of mine, Robert Mnookin, who's a professor at Harvard Law School and who head of the Harvard Negotiating Project. And he sent around a lot of friends that he liked, including this fellow Daniel Horowitz, who was the son of the first, Bill Horowitz was the first Jewish trustee of Yale University. And he said that his father, as a trustee, had intervened to prevent Whitney Griswold from firing Bill Kaufman. And when that letting the copy was sent to Peter. So I don't know all the politics going on. It was a rough time. Everyone was being tested.
Yeah.
And we're being tested today.
You had mentioned that maybe the solution was to activate higher education and those in that community to be more proactive. I think it seems to me there's a deep-seated anger and resentment towards the elite that's the Ivy League, etc. And I have two thoughts. One, how to cope with that, and two, do you think that the availability of information through the internet has broken down structure to the point that it's more and more difficult for higher education to prevail?
So, a lot of the premises of democratic society have gone out the window. The idea that the question is, was the age of reason possible anyway? Is it possible for human beings to be reasonable, rational? When you look back through history, all the way back to being, you never find a period when we behave reasonably. They're all these wars of, 9 million people died on the question of whether transubstantiation occurred in communion. So when you look back at the human species, so what do you do when education itself is made the enemy? And you're kind of that way today, isn't it true? That's the cultural issue. So once your culture degraded education, degraded science, degraded toleration, degraded values that are fundamental to what do you do? Very tough problem. Very tough problem. But I do know one thing you don't do. You don't stay silent. You don't stay silent. Please note, my son is leading the applause.
Is there a question from the student side of the room? I'm curious. Oh, down there.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. I was wondering, I was curious about your opinions on why you think the sentence should be abolished.
Yeah.
What?
The Senate being abolished.
Oh,
His son
yeah,
is one
okay.
Senate should be abolished.
So, The idea of the Federalists, when he cuts through all the baloney, is that they wanted rich people to run the country. They wanted the elite to run the country. And they set up ways that aren't immediately apparent to achieve it. One of the ways that isn't immediately apparent is that they had state legislatures choose United States senators. They had state legislatures choose how you choose the president, the election system. And those state legislatures had religious and property qualifications, particularly for the senates in those state legislatures. So they basically had lords spiritual and temporal in control of these state legislatures, and they had a veto over everything that happened. The Senate today, states representing as few as 15% of the country constitute a majority in the United States Senate. When you find that 90% of the people want something but it's not happening, it's because those middle states, which have the least higher education, the least industry, the least everything, those states are dictating what the rest of the country could do. So the big states in the West Coast, East Coast with higher, big research institutions, they're being outvoted by these states, Kentucky and stuff like that. And so when you have 15% outvoting 85%, is that a democracy or is that an aristocracy? That's an aristocracy. And you're not going to have a democracy as long as that's in place. Now I could take you, the article in Harvard I wrote, you know, as a child of the 60s, I'm always undertaking these quixotic efforts. So I wrote a piece, 6,000 words, that was in Harper's Magazine. It covered it's on the whole month around it, the essay. But the whole cover was because I wrote my essay. I was ecstatic. And all the arguments, you know, I mean, the choice, I consider the essay. But here it is. The only three places in America you can get 6,000 words published in an argument. There's Atlantic, there's Harper, and the New Yorker. That's it. I had Harper's a whole month. Big. What happened? Well, we still have a Senate. That's the way life goes. What?
I got a question. I think this is our last question.
So I'm curious about your thoughts about online as a platform for education in general and the constrained number of students that are at Yale and possibilities for expanding education.
Okay. So here's my thought about that. For, you know, these yearbooks they do every 5 years, your class has a book. You write an essay, this and the other thing. So this is my 60th Yale reunion. I figure it's my last essay. Whatever I have to say before I leave the earth, I'm going to say it in this 500 words. So in the 500 words, among the things I gave my conclusions about life, about meaning, about all kinds of stuff. The last one, I said, is that in my opinion, and this is not something going to change overnight, the university is an outdated model. It's based on the University of Bologna at the end of the 11th century, when congregating students around experts became the model for higher education. That idea was necessary then because the teachers had the books. Nobody else had the books. They had to read books. And the expertise and all that stuff. So that model became the model for American education, bringing people together around, living together, whatever, together. That's the idea. But there's a big problem with that. That is, if Yale wants to add 400 students, it has to build some college with, you know, $400 million, right, or something. And if, not to say that Yale doesn't have continuing education, so online does, but it's not Yale's mission. It doesn't see, Yale doesn't, people jump on me, I'm wrong, but it's not Yale's mission to educate the world. But how easy couldn't it be to educate the world? How easy would it be? A model of education where 1 million people or 2 million people are paying $1 a piece for a lecture instead of students at $80,000 a pop paying to be there. Where the opportunity cost of vast real estate is an alternative expense to a very small cost to reach everybody in the world. That Ethiopian kid who would love a education but doesn't have the money to cross the street could get that education if the model were different. So I think there's some room for imagination. As you know, as Coffin used to say, it's all about imagination. And so that issue of what is the appropriate dimensions of a university and how do those dimensions affect its mission and its abilities, that I think is a big subject for discussion.